I was sprawled on the couch in our Atlanta living room one Saturday night, bored out of my mind with Mom buried in her accounting spreadsheets upstairs, when I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from her liquor cabinet, figuring I'd loosen up and see if Dick, my stepdad, would bite at a little fun for once. He'd always been the one to fix my bike or slip me coffee when I pulled all-nighters, his 57-year-old ex-bouncer bulk softened by years patrolling parking lots, and I'd never minded his hovering, so I poured 2 glasses, calling him from the kitchen to join me, saying he couldn't let me drink alone like some sad college dropout. He walked in, raising an eyebrow at the bottle, but took the glass, muttering that I'd better not tell Mom he was breaking her no-liquor rule, and I grinned, clinking mine against his, telling him I'd keep his secrets if he kept mine. We sank into the couch, the TV off, the room quiet except for the hum of the AC and distant traffic outside, and I teased him about being too straight-laced now, saying the guy who'd tossed troublemakers out of clubs must have had wilder nights than this, my foot nudging his knee to see if he'd push back. He laughed, low and rough, saying I'd lose that bet, but he leaned closer, his arm brushing the cushion near mine, and I felt a buzz that wasn't just the whiskey, like I'd finally cracked his usual gruff routine. I spotted an old twister box under the coffee table, probably left from Mom's team-building phase, and pulled it out, daring him to play, saying it'd prove he wasn't as rusty as he looked, my voice light but sharp, testing how far he'd go with me egging him on. He groaned, saying I was trouble, but he didn't stop me as I unrolled the mat, kicking aside a rug, and spun the dial, calling out right hand blue while I stretched across, giggling when the whiskey made my balance wobble. Deck stood, tossing back the last of his drink, and joined in, planting his hand on green, his frame looming over me as I teased that he moved like he still had some fight in him, my shoulder bumping his when I reached for red. I spun again, left foot yellow, and we twisted closer, my hair falling in my face, and I blew it away, catching his eyes on me, steady, like he wasn't just playing the game anymore, and I smirked, saying he'd better keep up or I'd win this round, my words carrying a spark I knew he felt too. I reached too far, my foot slipping, and I toppled, crashing into him, my hands grabbing his shirt as we hit the mat, his arms wrapping around me to break the fall, holding me tight against his chest, his breath hot and uneven. I laughed, slurring that he'd cheated by catching me, my fingers curling into his collar, lingering as I looked up, saying he didn't mind losing like this, did he, my voice soft, daring, the room spinning from more than just the booze. He didn't let go right away, his grip firm, and I felt his pulse under my palm, fast, like mine, until a car horn blared outside, sharp through the open window, and he eased back, muttering we'd had enough for one night, his voice rougher than before. I rolled off, sitting up, saying he couldn't quit on me yet, tossing the spinner at him, my foot brushing his leg as I stretched, keeping the air charged, but he stood, saying Mom might come down if we got too loud, though her office light was still on, oblivious. He grabbed the glasses, heading to the kitchen, and I called after him, saying next time I'd pick a game he couldn't dodge, my tone playful, watching his shoulders tense as he paused in the doorway. I stayed on the mat, heart pounding, knowing Mom was clueless upstairs, but something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. A few days after the twister mess, I wandered into the backyard at dusk, restless from another day of Mom's accounting calls echoing through the house, when I spotted Deck sitting on the old wooden swing set he'd fixed for me years ago, a paperback open in his hands, his security guard uniform swapped for a loose shirt. I'd been dodging his usual coffee runs or quick chats since that night, not sure what I'd stirred up, but I walked over, saying he looked too comfortable for a guy who'd wrestled drunks back in his club days, my tone light to test the water after how we'd left things. He glanced up, closing the book, saying I'd better not start trouble out here where the neighbors could hear, but his grin betrayed him, inviting me to sit, and I climbed onto the swing, letting it sway, my sneakers brushing the grass. I leaned back, saying he owed me a story for bailing on our game, and when he patted the seat beside him, telling me to stop swinging like a kid, I slid over, lying across his lap instead, my head resting on his knee, teasing that he'd have to read to me now, like he used to when I couldn't sleep. He laughed, soft, his hand settling on my hair, stroking slow, and I felt the warmth of his fingers, steady, familiar from years of him checking my bike tires or handing me snacks, but different now, heavier, like we both knew it wasn't just habit anymore. I tilted my head, looking up, saying he picked boring books, but he should keep going, my voice quiet, daring him to stay this close, and he didn't pull away, just kept smoothing my hair, his thumb grazing my temple, sending a shiver I didn't hide. I asked why he'd stuck around after those wild years, when he could have kept chasing fights or bars instead of playing house with Mom, and he paused, his hand stilling, saying he'd seen enough guys burn out to know better, but his eyes flicked to mine, like I was pulling at something he'd locked up tight. I shifted, curling closer, my arm draped over his leg, saying he didn't seem done with trouble, not with me around, my words soft, teasing, meant to tug at him, and he chuckled, but his fingers tightened in my hair, just enough to make my breath catch. The swing creaking under us as the sky turned purple, the air thick with cicadas and something sharper we weren't naming. A neighbor's sprinkler hissed on, spraying too close to the fence, and I sat up, still in his lap, saying we'd get soaked if we didn't move, but I leaned into him instead, my shoulder against his chest, asking if he'd ever run from anything besides water. My grin sharp, pushing for a crack in his calm. He looked down, his hand sliding to my shoulder, holding there, and said I'd be surprised what he dodged, his voice low, rough, like he meant more than old fights, and I reached up, brushing a leaf from his collar, letting my fingers linger, saying I'd bet I could outrun him now, my eyes holding his, the moment stretching tight until a dog barked nearby, loud, snapping us back. He stood, helping me off the swing, saying Mom might come looking if she heard us out here, though her office light burned steady through the window, her focus on numbers, not us. I stepped close, saying he'd better pick a better hideout next time, my hand grazing his arm as I turned, feeling his gaze follow me to the porch. He picked up his book, but didn't open it, and I walked inside, my pulse loud, knowing Mom was upstairs, clueless, but the backyard wasn't just hers anymore, and I wondered how long Dick would keep pretending it was. A week after the swing set moment, I got antsy one evening with Mom locked in her home office crunching numbers for some deadline, so I told Dick we needed to hit Atlanta's night market, claiming I wanted his help picking out a gift for her birthday to keep her from suspecting I just needed to get out. He grumbled, saying markets were a hassle, but I leaned against the kitchen counter, twirling my hair, saying he'd been dodging fun since he stopped throwing punches for a living, and his half-smile told me he'd cave before he grabbed his jacket and followed me to his truck. I teased him on the drive, saying he'd better not bore me with his mall cop stories, my hand brushing his arm when I changed the radio, and he shot me a look, saying I'd be begging for those stories by the end of the night, his voice carrying a spark that kept me grinning. The market was packed, neon signs flashing over stalls selling tacos, jewelry, and clothes, the air thick with fried dough and reggae from a busker nearby, and I pulled Dick through the crowd, saying we'd find something classy for Mom, though my eyes were on a lingerie booth tucked between a candle stand and a guy hawking hats. I stopped there, picking up a lacy black bra, holding it up and asking Dick if he thought it'd suit me, my voice playful, watching his neck flush as he muttered I was out of line, but he didn't look away, his hands shoved in his pockets like he was fighting to stay calm. I laughed, tossing it back, saying I'd bet he'd seen wilder things working bars, and stepped closer, my shoulder grazing his, daring him to admit he wasn't as stiff as he acted, the crowd's noise fading as his eyes locked on mine, steady, like he was sizing up more than my joke. I moved to another rack, flipping through silk slips, asking if he'd ever bought anything like this back when he was young and free, my fingers lingering on the fabric, slow, teasing, and he cleared his throat, saying I'd better focus on Mom's gift before he dragged me out, but his voice was rough, and he stayed close, his arm brushing mine when someone bumped us. I picked a red camisole, holding it against myself, saying I might get it anyway, just to see who'd notice, my grin sharp, meant to rattle him, and he leaned in, saying I played dirty, his breath warm, close enough I felt it on my cheek, making my pulse jump like it had on the swing, only sharper now with the stakes higher. A vendor, an older woman with hoop earrings, chuckled, saying we made a cute couple, and I froze, my hand dropping the camisole, while Dex stepped back, his face hardening, telling her she got it wrong, his words clipped, like she'd hit a nerve he wasn't ready for. I laughed it off, saying he was just my ride, but my stomach twisted, and I grabbed a scarf from another stall, saying it'd do for Mom, tossing cash down to move on, my teasing gone flat as Deck trailed me, silent, the market's buzz louder now, pressing in. I turned, saying he didn't have to sulk, that I'd behave next time, my voice light again, brushing his sleeve to pull him back, and he nodded, but his jaw stayed tight, like he was chewing on something he couldn't spit out. We headed to the truck, the scarf stuffed in my bag, and I leaned against the door, saying he'd survived my worst, hadn't he? My fingers tapping his wrist, quick, playful, to shake the weirdness, and he smirked, saying I hadn't seen his yet. His eyes catching mine too long before he climbed in. Mom's light was still on when we got home, her focus on spreadsheets, not us, and I slipped inside, feeling the vendor's words linger, knowing Dick felt them too, and wondering what else I'd misread about him. A month after the market's awkward vibe, I was flipping through TV channels one humid Atlanta evening when Dick walked into the living room, tossing his keys down, saying he was heading to an old boxing gym downtown and asked if I wanted to tag along to see where he used to train before he settled for mall security shifts. I raised an eyebrow, surprised he'd invite me anywhere after how tense we'd left things, but I hopped up, saying he'd better not expect me to just watch him sweat, my tone teasing to test if he'd bite, and he smirked, saying I'd be the one begging for a break, his eyes glinting like they did when I'd pushed him on the swing, making me grab my sneakers and follow him out before Mom noticed, her office door shut tight with another late-night audit. The gym was a gritty hole in the wall, smelling of leather and liniment, with heavy bags swaying under flickering fluorescents and a few guys sparring in a ring while a radio blared hip-hop through crackling speakers. Dick tossed me a pair of wraps, saying I couldn't just stand there looking lost, and I wound them around my hands, joking that I'd knock him out if he wasn't careful, my shoulder bumping his as I stepped closer, daring him to laugh it off. He showed me a jab, his hands guiding my wrists, steady but light, and I leaned into it, saying he must have scared off plenty with those moves, my voice playful, meant to dig, and he chuckled, saying I'd be surprised who he couldn't scare, his fingers lingering near mine, sending a jolt I didn't let show. We moved to a bag, and he held it while I punched, telling me to hit like I meant it, so I swung harder, saying I'd bet he threw harder punches when he wasn't playing family man for Mom, my grin sharp, pushing for a reaction as sweat beaded on my neck. He stepped behind me, adjusting my stance, his hands on my shoulders, firm, and I twisted, saying he'd better watch it or I'd turn on him, my eyes catching his, close enough to feel his breath, the gym's noise fading as he said I wouldn't dare, his voice low, teasing back, like he was testing how far I'd go. I swung again, the bag thudding, and asked why he quit fighting for real, figuring he'd dodge, but he said he'd lost one too many to keep swinging, his hands dropping, his gaze heavy, like I'd hit something softer than leather. A trainer yelled across the room, calling Dick over to check some old gear, breaking the moment, and I kept jabbing, watching him talk, his frame still broad like it belonged here, not in Mom's tidy world of spreadsheets and schedules. I walked over when he waved me, saying he'd show me the ring next, and I climbed in, bouncing on my toes, saying I'd take him down just to see him try, my hands brushing his arm as I ducked an imaginary punch, laughing when he mimed one back, slow, letting me slip past, our dance charged, like we were fighting something neither of us named. He said I'd fit right in with the troublemakers he used to know, and I leaned against the ropes, saying trouble was more fun with him around, my voice soft, deliberate, watching his jaw tighten, his eyes holding mine too long. The gym's lights dimmed, closing time hitting, and a janitor swept nearby, clanging a bucket, pulling us back to reality, but I stayed close, saying he'd better bring me again or I'd find my own ring, my fingers tapping his wrist, quick, flirty, as we grabbed our stuff. He drove us home, Mom's car still in the drive, her focus on work, not us, and I leaned over before getting out, saying he'd regret teaching me to fight, my smile daring him to answer. But he just gripped the wheel, watching me head inside, the night heavy with what we'd left in that ring. By summer, I was itching for something to break the monotony of Atlanta's sticky nights, with Mom drowning in tax season prep, when Dick texted me late one Tuesday, asking if I'd meet him at a 24-hour diner near his security post, saying he needed to talk after a rough shift and figured I'd be up anyway. I slipped out, leaving Mom's office light burning upstairs, her focus glued to spreadsheets, and drove to the diner, a neon-lit spot off the highway with chipped counters and a jukebox humming old soul tunes, finding Dick in a corner booth, still in his guard uniform, looking worn but wired, like he'd been carrying something heavier than his flashlight. I slid in across from him, teasing that he'd dragged me out past midnight just to complain, my foot nudging his under the table, light, to see if he'd push back, and he smirked, saying I'd come running anyway, his eyes catching mine with a warmth that felt too easy after the gym. I ordered a milkshake, he got coffee, and I leaned forward, asking what was so urgent he couldn't wait till morning, my fingers tracing the straw's wrapper, slow, playful, Watching him notice as he said a fight at work had him rethinking things he'd buried since his bouncing days. I grinned, saying he'd looked ready to throw punches in that ring. So what was different now? My voice soft, coaxing, daring him to spill, and he leaned closer, his hands wrapping the mug, saying I made it hard to keep things buried, his tone rough, like I'd tugged a thread he'd meant to cut. I kicked off my shoe, letting my foot brush his shin, quick, flirty, saying he didn't seem to mind digging with me, and he didn't pull away, just held my gaze, the diner's buzz fading as the air between us tightened, like it had when we danced around punches. He started talking about a night he'd broken up a bar brawl, how he'd almost lost himself in it, and I listened, chin on my hand, saying he sounded more alive back then than patrolling empty lots for Mom's stable life, my words sharp, meant to sting. And he said stability wasn't her idea, it was his eyes dark, like I'd hit a truth he hadn't shared before. I reached across, my fingers grazing his knuckles, saying I liked him better unstable, my voice low, teasing, and he didn't move his hand, letting mine rest there, his thumb twitching like he might turn it over. The moment heavy until a guy in a security jacket walked in, calling Deck's name, saying he'd left his radio at the post. Deck yanked his hand back, standing to talk to the guy, his coworker, who glanced at me, asking if I was Deck's kid, and I laughed, saying I was just keeping him company, but my chest tightened, knowing how it looked. Mom clueless at home while we sat here playing with fire. Deck sent the guy off, sitting back, saying we should wrap up, his voice clipped, like the interruption had slapped him awake, but I leaned in, saying he couldn't run from me that easy, my foot nudging his again, slower, holding his eyes to pull him back. He shook his head, saying I didn't know what I was starting, but he didn't leave, and I sipped my shake, saying I bet I could finish it, my words double-edged, the jukebox switching to a slower song that matched the pulse I felt. The diner's clock ticked past 2 a.m., and I said Mom wouldn't miss us, not with her deadlines, but Deck checked his phone, saying she'd called earlier, probably routine, and we should go before she worried. I stood, tossing cash down, saying he'd better call me again if he got restless, my hand brushing his arm as I passed, lingering to feel his tension, and he followed me out, the night air thick, his truck parked close to mine. I turned, saying next time I'd pick the spot, my grin daring him to argue, and he just watched me drive off, his headlights fading in my rear view, leaving me wondering what he'd say if Mom ever asked where he'd been. 6 months after the Twister night, Mom was supposed to be at a weekend accounting conference in Savannah, leaving the house empty, when I wandered into her bedroom one humid Atlanta evening, finding Deck crouched by the bed, wrestling with a creaky headboard he'd promised to fix before she got back. I'd been restless all day, dodging his usual check-ins since the diner, but I leaned against the doorframe, saying he looked like he needed a hand unless he planned to break it worse, my tone light to mask the buzz I felt seeing him there, his old bouncer strength still sharp under a worn t-shirt. He glanced up, saying I'd better not distract him unless I knew a wrench from a screwdriver, and I stepped inside, tossing my phone on the dresser, teasing that I'd learned plenty from watching him fuss over me all these years, my eyes catching his to see if he'd bite. I grabbed a tool from his kit, handing it over, my fingers brushing his palm, deliberate, slow, and he took it, muttering I was too close for his focus, but he didn't move away, his hands working the bolts while I stood near, asking why he bothered with chores when he could be out raising hell like he used to before Mom's schedules tamed him. He smirked, saying hell was overrated, but his voice was rough, and I leaned against the bedpost, saying he didn't fool me, not after I'd seen him light up in that ring, my words soft, pulling at the guy he'd buried, my shoulder grazing his when he stood to test the frame. The room was quiet, just the hum of a fan and crickets outside, Mom's perfume bottles glinting on the dresser, her absence making the air feel looser, riskier, like we could say anything and get away with it. I sat on the bed's edge, handing him another screw, my hand lingering near his, and he knelt closer, fixing the last bolt, his arm brushing mine, steady, warm, sending a jolt I didn't hide as I said he'd owe me for playing assistant, my voice low, daring him to answer. He looked up, his hands still, saying I'd already cost him enough sleep, his eyes locked on mine, dark, like he'd stopped fighting whatever this was, and I shifted, my knee nudging his side, teasing that he'd survive a little more trouble, the mattress creaking under me, pulling us into a space too small for both of us. He stood, slow, stepping closer, his shadow falling over me, and I tilted my head, saying he didn't have to fix everything, not tonight, my fingers grazing his wrist, light, testing, feeling his pulse jump, the air so thick I could barely breathe. He leaned in, his hand hovering near my shoulder, not touching, just close enough I felt the heat, and I stood, inches from him, the bed behind us, my breath shaky as I said he'd never scared me, not even now, my voice barely a whisper. Every word winding us tighter, his eyes burning, his fingers flexing like he might close the gap. The headboard rattled when I bumped it, and he reached to steady it, his arm brushing my side, lingering, our faces too close, the room shrinking to just us, teetering on a line we'd danced around for months, every second screaming for something to give. Then the front door slammed downstairs, Mom's voice shouting my name, sharp, furious, her footsteps pounding up the stairs, and Deck jerked back, his face pale, as she burst in, her conference bag hitting the floor, yelling what the hell we were doing in her room. Her eyes wild, cutting through us like glass. I stammered, saying we were just fixing the bed, but her scream drowned me out, calling Deck a liar, saying she'd known something was off, and I grabbed my phone, bolting past her, my chest tight, knowing she'd never believe it was nothing, not after this. Deck stood frozen, her voice chasing me down the hall, and I hit the stairs, the house feeling smaller, broken, like everything we'd built had cracked in one night.